Probe 1138 found something at 7.2 astronomical units that wasn't in any catalog. I'd been running the swarm for 11 months at that point. 200 autonomous survey units spread across a grid the size of a small solar system, cataloging every rock, ice fragment, and piece of debris between Jupiter and Saturn. We'd logged over 40,000 objects in that time. The process was routine. A probe detects mass, photographs it, transmits the data, and moves on. 40,000 times. That's exactly what happened. Object 40,001 was different. The initial telemetry from probe 1138 flagged it as a possible dwarf planet. Significant mass, very low albedo, nearly invisible against the background. Surface temperature was 11 Kelvin above predicted for a body at that distance and that albedo. Not a lot, enough to flag. And the probe moved in for a closer look and transmitted 47 photographic frames over a period of 9 minutes. Then it stopped transmitting. Then 5 other probes in the swarm, units that were grid sectors away, running their own assignments, broke formation and began converging on the same coordinates. I didn't tell them to do that. Nobody did. Cassini-Huygens 2 was not a prestige assignment. It was a relay station, 3 modules and a docking port positioned at the L4 Lagrange point between Jupiter and Saturn. A gravitationally stable pocket of nothing where the orbital mechanics worked out for coordinating a probe swarm. The station had been in continuous operation since 2026. We were the 9th crew. By the time I arrived, every surface had the particular smoothness of metal that's been touched by too many hands. The equipment was functional in the way that equipment is functional when the maintenance budget was cut 4 years ago and nobody reinstated it. Things worked. They just worked with a hesitation. A half-second delay on the airlock cycle, a flicker in the overhead lights in Module B that nobody could trace. The water recycler made a sound every 40 minutes that the previous crew's logs described as normal. It was not a normal sound. The crew was 3. Commander Okafor, career military, transferred to the survey program after 20 years in orbital logistics. Efficient, by the book, the kind of commander who ran meetings at 0700 regardless of whether there was anything to discuss. Singh, communications specialist, managed our uplink to Earth and the data relay to the probe swarm. Quiet during the day. Less quiet at night. I'll get to that. And me, Ferraro. Probe systems. My job was the swarm. 200 autonomous survey units, each about the size of a washing machine, equipped with multi-spectrum cameras, mass spectrometers, and a navigational AI that could independently identify, photograph, and catalog objects within a predefined grid. I programmed them. I monitored them. I fixed them when they broke, which was often because the units were 7 years old and the replacement parts budget had been redirected to the Europa program. We were not a priority. The deep survey between the gas giants was the kind of mission that exists because someone wrote it into a budget 15 years ago and nobody had bothered to cancel it. We cataloged rocks, we measured ice, we mapped gravitational microfields. The data went to Earth, where it was processed by algorithms and stored in databases that graduate students might reference in 20 years. It was not glamorous, it was not urgent. It was the scientific equivalent of counting grains of sand on a beach that nobody visits. I loved it. I loved the quiet and the routine and the 200 small machines doing exactly what I told them to do, moving through the dark in perfect formation, seeing things no human eye had ever seen, even if those things were just rocks. Every object they found was new. Every catalog entry was first contact with a piece of the universe that had been drifting in silence since the formation of the solar system. That meant something to me. Maybe only to me. The station orbited nothing. That's the thing people don't understand about Lagrange points. You're not orbiting a planet or a moon. You're sitting in a gravitational equilibrium, a place where the pull of Jupiter and the pull of Saturn and the pull of the Sun all balance out, and you just hang there. Stationary relative to the planets. Stationary relative to everything. The stars don't move outside the viewport. The planets don't shift. Nothing changes. You look out the window and the universe is frozen. For 18 months, that frozen frame is your entire world. The nearest human outpost was Ganymede Colony. 14 days by fast transit. Earth was a signal delay of 48 minutes each way. You send a message at noon, you get a response at 1:36 if someone's paying attention. If it's a weekend or a holiday, you might wait until Monday. We were not a priority. The probes were my design. They're not literally. They were built by Northrop under a JPL contract. But the behavioral algorithms were mine. I'd written the navigation code during my postdoc, a swarm intelligence model that allowed each unit to operate independently while maintaining formation coherence. Each probe made its own decisions about approach vectors, photography angles, and data prioritization. They communicated with each other through a mesh network, sharing discoveries and adjusting their search patterns in real time. I'd given them rules, simple rules. Approach unidentified mass, photograph from 3 angles minimum, transmit data to relay station, await acknowledgement. If no acknowledgement within 6 hours, proceed to next grid sector. Do not deviate from assigned grid without command override. Do not approach objects larger than 10 kilometers without command authorization. The rules were clear. They had been clear for 7 years across 9 crew rotations. Not once had a probe deviated from its behavioral parameters. Not once. The swarm was reliable. It was the most reliable thing on the station. The most reliable thing in my life, probably. At 0200 on day 334, I was in the probe ops bay running a routine diagnostic cycle. Most of the probes were in sleep mode, powered down except for passive sensors, conserving energy until their next survey window. 12 were active, running a sweep of Grid 7, a sector of the survey area that had been producing anomalous mass readings for the past 3 weeks. Not alarming anomalies. The kind of minor gravitational inconsistencies that usually meant an uncharted asteroid cluster or a dense ice field. I'd flagged Grid 7 for additional passes, standard procedure. Singh found me there at 0230. He was supposed to be asleep. He wasn't. He hadn't been sleeping well for about a month. I'd hear him in the corridor during the late hours, moving between modules, sometimes stopping at the comm panel in Module A. I asked him once what he was doing. He said checking the uplink. I asked him what for. He said he thought he'd heard something on the deep space channel. A pattern in the background static. I told him there was no pattern. I'd run the signal analysis myself. Background noise was background noise. He said I was probably right. He didn't sound convinced. But that night, the night of day 334, Singh came into the probe ops bay and stood behind my chair and watched the monitors for a few minutes without saying anything. Then he said, "Something's wrong with Grid 7. I told him the anomalous mass readings were being investigated. Standard procedure. He shook his head. He said, "I don't mean the mass readings, I mean the sound." I asked what sound. He said, "The one coming from Grid 7. I pulled up the acoustic monitoring data from the active probes in that sector. Deep space is not silent. There are electromagnetic emissions, solar wind interactions, the faint hiss of cosmic microwave background. The probes recorded all of it. I filtered for anomalous frequencies. There was nothing outside normal parameters. I told Singh so. He looked at the data for a long time. Then he said, "It's below what the probes can hear." Something about the way he said it made me not ask a follow-up question. There were other things I chose not to think about. Cargo Bay C, for instance. The station manifest. The document that listed every piece of equipment, every consumable, every component aboard CH-2 listed Cargo Bay C as empty, sealed and empty. Decommissioned after a previous rotation had removed the last of its stored equipment. But the station's power distribution log showed Cargo Bay C drawing 40 watts from the main bus, consistently, 24 hours a day. 40 watts isn't much. It's a light bulb. But it was a light bulb running in a room that was supposed to be empty and sealed. I asked Okafor about it during a morning meeting. She checked the manifest, confirmed it was listed as empty, and said the 40-watt draw was likely a monitoring sensor left active during decommission. She said she'd put in a maintenance request. The maintenance request went into the queue. The queue was 6 weeks long. The 40 watts kept drawing. March 7th, day 341. Probe 1138 entered Grid 7 on its standard survey pass and detected a mass anomaly at coordinates that had been empty 3 days prior. The initial reading classified it as a rogue planetoid, estimated diameter 400 kilometers, mass consistent with a dense silicate body, albedo 0.02, nearly invisible. The object was so dark that 1138 almost missed it entirely. The only reason it flagged was the thermal discrepancy. A body that size, at that distance from the sun, at that albedo, should have had a surface temperature of roughly 48 Kelvin. Probe 138's infrared sensor measured 59. 11 degrees above predicted. It's a small number. In astrophysics, small numbers are where everything hides. I authorized the approach protocol. Standard procedure: the probe would close to 10 kilometers, photograph from 3 angles, transmit, and await further instruction. The approach took 4 hours. During those 4 hours, the mass reading fluctuated. Not by much, 3 to 5% variance, enough to notice. Solid bodies don't fluctuate. A planet, an asteroid, a dwarf planetoid, their mass is their mass. It doesn't change over a 4-hour window unless something is wrong with the sensor. I ran a remote diagnostic on 1138's mass spectrometer, clean. I ran it again, clean. The mass was fluctuating because the object's mass was fluctuating. I didn't have an explanation for that. I logged it. At 1422, probe 1138 reached the 10-kilometer boundary and began its photographic pass. The first images arrived at the station 9 seconds later, light-speed transmission across a very short distance. I expected rock. Cratered, gray, unremarkable. The same thing I'd seen 40,000 times. The first frame showed something else. The surface was not rock. The texture was wrong. Instead of the random pitting and scarring you see on asteroids, impact craters, fracture lines, the geological signature of 4 billion years of collisions, the surface had structure. Parallel ridges running across the frame, evenly spaced, curving gently, like ribs, like the segmented body of something arthropodal, scaled up to a size that my brain initially refused to register. The color was wrong too. Not gray, pale, the color of dried cartilage, of bone left in deep water until the minerals leach out and leave behind a ghost of structure. Between the ridges, in the shallow valleys where one section met the next, there was a faint discoloration, a blue-green tint that didn't match any mineral composition in the database. The probe continued its photographic pass. Frame by frame, the images arrived, each one showing more of the surface, each one more wrong than the last. At frame 23, the probe was close enough to resolve fine detail. And I saw the growths. Clustered along the tops of the ridges, spread in patterns that suggested organic distribution rather than geological process. Barnacle-like structures, encrusted, layered. Some of them cracked open to reveal darker material underneath. They looked ancient. Not centuries ancient. The kind of ancient where you stop using human timescales and start talking about epochs. At frame 34, the blue-green tint in the valleys resolved into something I didn't expect. It was light, not reflected sunlight. At 7.2 astronomical units, the sun provides barely enough light to read by. This was generated, a faint, barely perceptible glow emanating from between the segments, pulsing slowly. The rhythm was inconsistent with any known mineral phosphorescence or chemical reaction. It pulsed, slowly, like breathing if breathing happened once every 40 minutes. Probe 1138 transmitted 47 frames. At frame 47, the feed cut, not degraded, cut. One frame, the surface, close, filling the camera's field of view. Next frame, static, then nothing. The probe's telemetry ping, which had been arriving every 4 seconds without fail for 11 months, stopped. But I logged the loss and began reviewing the 47 frames. While I was reviewing, the swarm display on the main monitor changed. 5 probes, units 0822, 0907, 1043, 1201, and 1344, broke formation simultaneously. They were in different grid sectors, running different survey assignments, between 2,000 and 8,000 kilometers from 1138's last known position. All 5 abandoned their current tasks and began navigating toward the coordinates, where 1138 had found the object. I hadn't issued that command. The swarm behavioral algorithms didn't include a convergence protocol for lost probe investigation. There was no rule in my code that said, if a probe goes silent, send others to its location. These 5 units had made that decision independently, or something had made it for them. I sent a manual override command to each of the 5 probes, ordering them to resume their assigned grid sectors. The command was acknowledged. The probes continued toward the object. I sent the override again. Acknowledged. Ignored. 3 more probes broke formation, then 2 more. By the end of the day, 12 of my 200 probes had abandoned their survey patterns and were converging on a point in grid 7 where something sat in the dark, 11 degrees warmer than it should have been, with a mass that wouldn't stay still. I reported the probe loss and the convergence anomaly to Mission Control at 0800 on March 8th. The message took 48 minutes to reach Earth. The response took 48 minutes to return. In between, I had an hour and 36 minutes of silence from the only people in the solar system who could help me. Their response arrived at 10:24. It was 3 sentences. They acknowledged the probe loss. They requested a full diagnostic report on the behavioral algorithms. They did not address the convergence anomaly. I sent the diagnostic report. Clean code. No errors, no bugs. No explanation for why 12 probes had decided to do something I hadn't told them to do. Mission Control's follow-up arrived 4 hours later. They suggested a firmware corruption event and recommended a swarm-wide reset. I knew it wasn't firmware corruption because firmware corruption doesn't make 12 independent machines fly in the same direction at the same time. But I ran the reset anyway. The probes accepted the reset. They rebooted. They resumed their assigned grid sectors for approximately 40 minutes. Then they turned around and headed back toward grid 7, all 12, plus 6 more that joined them after the reset. 18 now. I stopped trying to redirect them. Instead, I started watching what they were doing. The probes that reached the object's vicinity didn't crash into it. They didn't orbit it. They arranged themselves at uniform distances around its perimeter, roughly 50 kilometers out, and began transmitting. Not to me, not to the station. Their mesh network, the communication system that allowed probe-to-probe data sharing, had activated a protocol I didn't recognize. The probes were talking to each other at a frequency and in a data format that wasn't in my code. I couldn't read it. The encryption, if it was encryption, didn't match any standard I'd programmed. My probes were speaking a language I hadn't taught them. While the swarm anomaly consumed my attention, more data was arriving from the object itself, and the surviving probes were still photographing. Each new image showed more of the surface. I began assembling a composite, stitching the overlapping frames into a single mosaic. The picture that emerged was troubling. The object was not spherical. Every planetoid, every asteroid above a certain mass is roughly spherical. Gravity pulls it into shape over billions of years. This object was elongated. The long axis was at least 3 times the short axis, and the surface was not uniform. The segmentation I'd seen in the early frames continued across the entire body, parallel ridges, regularly spaced, curving from one end to the other, like vertebrae, like the body segments of something from the deep ocean scaled to a size that shouldn't exist. The mass continued to fluctuate. I ran a time series analysis on the fluctuations and found a pattern. The mass readings didn't change randomly. They oscillated. A slow cycle, roughly 40 minutes from peak to trough. The same 40-minute interval as the bioluminescent pulse. The same 40 minutes as the water recycler's groan. The same 40 minutes as the power draw fluctuation in cargo bay C, which I checked on a hunch, and yes, the 40-watt draw wasn't constant. It pulsed every 40 minutes. The whole station was breathing at the same rhythm as the thing in grid 7. I didn't tell Singh or Okafor about the 40-minute correlation. Not yet. I wasn't ready to say out loud what the correlation implied. because what it implied was that the object and the station were connected, and that the 40 watts in cargo bay C and the bioluminescent glow between the object's segments and the mass fluctuations in the pulse in the deep space background that Singh could hear and I couldn't. All of it was the same signal, the same rhythm, the same heartbeat. Okafor scheduled a status meeting for 700 on March 10th. During the meeting, I presented the probe data, the photographs, the mass fluctuations, the convergence anomaly. I presented it clinically, factually, without interpretation. Okafor studied the photographs for a long time. Then she asked me what I thought we were looking at. I said I didn't know. She said it looked geological. I said yes, it looked geological. But I didn't think it was. She asked me what I meant. I showed her the thermal map. Surface temperature wasn't uniform. There were zones. Warmer regions and cooler regions distributed across the body in a pattern that didn't correspond to solar exposure or geological composition. The warm zones aligned with the bioluminescent areas. The cool zones aligned with the ridges. I told her the thermal distribution was consistent with a biological system. Internal metabolic processes generating heat in some regions, calcified external structures insulating others. Okafor looked at me for 10 seconds. Then she said, "Are you telling me that thing is alive?" I said the data was consistent with that interpretation. She said, "The data is also consistent with a geologically active planetoid with subsurface volcanism and mineral phosphorescence." I said yes, it was. She said, "Let's go with that for now." I said okay, but I didn't go with that. Because planetoids don't make 18 probes abandon their programming and arrange themselves in a perimeter formation and start speaking a language they were never taught. Planetoids don't have heartbeats. March 12th, 400. I finished the composite mosaic. 47 frames from probe 1138, plus an additional 200 frames from the 18 perimeter probes, all stitched into a single image covering approximately 60% of the object's visible surface. I'd been building it for 4 days, correcting for parallax, adjusting for the probe's different approach angles, filling gaps where the coverage overlapped imperfectly. The process was mechanical. I could do it in my sleep. I nearly was doing it in my sleep. I'd been awake for 22 hours, but at 0400, when the final frame locked into place and the compositing software rendered the complete mosaic on the main monitor, I stopped being tired. The shape on my screen was not a planetoid. It wasn't a geological body. It wasn't anything that any branch of any science I'd spent my career studying had a category for. The mosaic showed a body, elongated, segmented, tapered at one end to a blunt, rounded point. The other end extended beyond the mosaic's coverage. The probes hadn't photographed enough to see where it ended. The segments were uniform in structure but varied in size, larger toward the hidden end, smaller toward the taper. Each segment was delineated by the deep ridges I'd been studying for days, and between each segment, the blue-green bioluminescence pulsed in its slow, patient cycle. The surface was covered in the barnacle-like accretions I'd documented, mineral growths layered over what I now understood was not stone, but tissue. Calcified. Ancient, but tissue. Living tissue that had hardened over timescales I couldn't calculate. This was not a rogue planetoid that happened to look organic. This was an organism that had been still for so long that it had begun to look geological. The mass fluctuations weren't sensor error. They were movement. Internal movement. Segments flexing against each other, the body shifting in its rest. The thermal zones weren't volcanism. They were metabolism. The organism was generating heat from biological processes, burning fuel, maintaining some minimum level of internal function while otherwise dormant. The bioluminescence wasn't mineral phosphorescence. It was a biological signaling system. Communicating what to whom, I don't know. But the 40-minute pulse was not random. It was a cycle, a heartbeat, a rhythm maintained by something alive. And the probes, my carefully programmed machines with their clear behavioral rules, had detected something that I couldn't detect. Some signal, some emission, some quality of the organism that the probe's sensors could perceive and their navigational AI could respond to. They weren't malfunctioning. They were responding. The way iron responds to a magnet, the way a compass responds to north. Something about this organism pulled them in. I sat in the probe ops bay at 0400, and I looked at the mosaic on my monitor. The segmented body of something I didn't have a word for, curled in the dark between Jupiter and Saturn. 7.2 astronomical units from the sun, resting, dormant, ancient. And I realized that I had been looking at it wrong. We all had. Houston had been looking at it wrong. Okafor had been looking at it wrong. We had been looking at an object, a discovery, a thing to be cataloged and classified and filed in a database. But it wasn't an object. It was an animal, the largest animal in the history of observed science, by a margin so vast that the concept of size became meaningless. And it was asleep. March 14th, 2 days after the mosaic. I'd spent those 2 days doing what I do, collecting data, obsessively, methodically, with the manic focus of a man who knows he's looking at the most important discovery in human history and also knows that nobody will believe him. I mapped the organism's thermal profile hour by hour. I tracked the mass fluctuations with millisecond precision. I analyzed every frame of probe photography for surface changes. I cataloged the bioluminescent pulse patterns. The 40-minute cycle was the dominant frequency, but there were subharmonics. Shorter pulses, faster, layered under the main rhythm like a heart with multiple chambers beating at different rates. I didn't sleep. Okafor ordered me to sleep. I told her I would. I didn't. At 1600 on March 14th, the 40-minute cycle changed. The bioluminescent pulse, which had been stable at 40 minutes for the entire observation period, shortened. 38 minutes, then 35, then 30. The organism's heartbeat was accelerating. The thermal readings climbed. The warm zones on the surface, the metabolic regions, were getting warmer. Not by much, a degree, then 2. Then 5. The mass fluctuations increased in amplitude. The organism was moving more, larger flexions, more frequent contractions. The probes in the perimeter formation detected the changes immediately. Their mesh network traffic spiked. Whatever language they'd been speaking, they were speaking it faster now, louder. 4 more probes broke formation from their grid sectors and headed for grid 7, then 7 more. The swarm was hemorrhaging. At 1700, I watched probe 0822, one of the original perimeter units, cross the 50-kilometer boundary and begin approaching the organism. It wasn't supposed to do that. The perimeter had been stable for days. Now 0822 was closing the distance, its camera feed showing the surface growing larger, the ridges resolving into canyons, the barnacle growths becoming structures the size of buildings. At 30 kilometers, 0822's feed began to distort. Not VHS degradation, electromagnetic interference. The organism's field was affecting the probe's systems. At 20 kilometers, the probe's telemetry went erratic. Mass readings from the probe's own spectrometer were spiking, as if the probe itself was gaining mass. That's not possible. At 10 kilometers, the feed showed the surface in extraordinary detail. The calcified tissue, the mineral growths, the bioluminescent channels pulsing now at 20-minute intervals, brighter, more insistent. At 5 kilometers, the camera captured something new. The ridges were separating. The segments were moving apart. Not by much, centimeters, maybe meters. It was hard to judge scale when each segment was the size of a small city. But the gaps between segments were widening. The organism was stretching, unfurling, waking up. At 3 kilometers, probe 0822 went dark, signal lost. But before it died, it transmitted one final image. The gap between 2 segments, seen from the side, widening, and in the gap, in the space between 2 calcified plates of ancient tissue, something deeper, darker, a cavity inside the organism, structures visible within, branching, vascular, wet-looking, and the glow, the bioluminescence, pouring out of the gap like light through a cracked door, blue-green. Blinding at that proximity. Wrong in every way my visual cortex could quantify. The last thing the probe saw was the inside of something that had been sleeping in the dark between two planets and was now, slowly, inevitably, opening its eyes. Except it didn't have eyes. Nothing about its anatomy suggested vision. It was opening something else. Something I don't have a word for. Probe 0907 went dark next, then 1043, then 1201. One by one, the perimeter probes crossed the boundary and closed in, drawn by whatever signal the organism was now broadcasting at full power, and one by one they went silent. Their final images were variations on the same theme. The organism's surface, closer and closer, the segments separating, the body unfolding, the bioluminescence intensifying from a faint pulse to a steady, throbbing glow that overwhelmed the probe's cameras before the signal cut. At 1800, the station shuddered. Not a vibration, a physical displacement. CH2 shifted laterally by approximately 0.4 meters. The gravitational field in our area of space had changed. Something with mass had moved. I ran to the science instruments and pulled the gravimetric data. The readings showed a gravitational wave, not the kind that LIGO detects, not two black holes colliding. A local gravitational disturbance consistent with a massive body-changing shape. The organism was unfolding. The curled, compressed body that the probes had found was straightening. Segments that had been stacked against each other were separating, extending, the full form emerging from what had been, essentially, a fetal position. And as it extended, its gravitational influence expanded. The 0.4 meter displacement of the station was the first effect. There would be more. At 1845, the station's power grid surged. Every light on CH2 flickered simultaneously. The monitors in the probe ops bay reset. The telemetry system dropped offline for 11 seconds. When it came back, the swarm display showed something I stared at for a long time. Of the 200 probes in my swarm, 34 had gone dark, the ones that had approached the organism. The remaining 166 were still active, but they weren't in their grid sectors. All 166 had changed course. Every single one of them was heading toward Grid 7. My entire swarm, my 200 carefully programmed machines, had abandoned their mission and were converging on an organism that had just woken up from a sleep that might have lasted longer than human civilization. And the station's instruments were now detecting something that made the probe convergence seem trivial. The organism's extended body, its full, unfurled form, was visible on the gravimetric sensors, not as an image, as a mass distribution, a gravitational footprint. The footprint stretched from the coordinates where the probes had found the curled body, outward, in one direction, for a distance that the sensors calculated and I recalculated and recalculated again because the number couldn't be right. The organism, fully extended, was approximately 3.8 astronomical units long. 3.8 astronomical units. The distance from the Sun to the outer edge of the asteroid belt. A single organism, longer than the diameter of the inner solar system. Drifting, waking, unfolding in the dark between Jupiter and Saturn. What the probes had found wasn't the organism. It was a segment, a joint, a single curled knuckle of something that straightened, stretched across a distance that light took 30 minutes to travel. I looked at the gravimetric data, and I understood, finally, what probe 1138 had photographed. Not a dwarf planet, a kneecap, a knuckle, a fraction of something so large that the concept of size was no longer useful. And it was moving. The station's viewport faced the general direction of Grid 7. I'd never seen anything through it except stars and the faint smudge of Jupiter. At 1900 on March 14th, I looked through the viewport and I could see it. Not the organism, not directly, but the absence of the organism. A region of the sky where stars had been was now dark. The organism's body, extended and in motion, was eclipsing background starlight as it unfolded. From the viewport of CH2, it looked like a strip of sky had been erased, a band of darkness cutting across the star field, wider at one end, narrower at the other, stretching from below the plane of Jupiter's orbit toward Saturn and beyond. not a shadow. A silhouette, and the largest silhouette I will ever see. The station shuddered again. 0.8 meters this time. The gravitational effects were increasing as the organism moved, not toward us, but near us. We were incidental, a mote of dust near something that had better places to be. The power surged again. The overhead lights in Module B died completely. The emergency lighting activated. Red, pulsing, the color of a warning that nobody could respond to. In the probe ops bay, my monitors flickered. The swarm display showed 142 probes still transmitting. The convergence continued. The organism's electromagnetic field was expanding with its body, and every probe that entered the field crossed a threshold and went dark. Silently, without distress signals, without final transmissions. They simply stopped existing as data points on my screen and became objects drifting in the wake of something that neither knew nor cared that they were there. Singh came into the probe ops bay. He looked at the monitors. He looked at the swarm display. He looked at the viewport. Then he said very calmly, "I told you there was a sound." I asked him what he could hear. He said it wasn't hearing, it was knowing. He said the thing in Grid 7 had been talking to the station since before we arrived. He said it talked through the power systems, through the 40 watts in Cargo Bay C, through the hum in the walls that was almost but not quite like the recycler. He said he'd been answering. I asked him what he'd been saying. He said he didn't know. So the words came out of him during the 0300 comm sessions, transmissions into the deep space channel that he didn't plan and couldn't remember. He said it felt like dreaming while awake, like something was thinking through him, using his voice and the station's transmitter to send patterns into the void. I should have been alarmed. I should have reported it. But I was looking at the viewport, at the band of missing stars, at the silhouette of something 3.8 astronomical units long, waking up from a sleep older than human language, and Singh's confession felt proportionate. Appropriate, even. Of course it had been communicating. Of course the station was part of the circuit. We'd been sitting in its electromagnetic field for 11 months. The 40 watts in Cargo Bay C, the 40-minute pulse in the power grid, the probes abandoning their programming. Like Singh's midnight transmissions. The whole station had been resonating with the organism since the day we arrived, and we'd cataloged each symptom as a separate anomaly. A power draw here, a sleep issue there, a probe behavior glitch somewhere else. We hadn't seen the pattern because the pattern was us. We were inside the pattern. At 2100, the station lurched. 2 meters this time. The gravitational displacement was now enough to trigger the emergency stabilization thrusters, which fired automatically, wasting fuel we couldn't replace to maintain a position in space that was no longer gravitationally stable. The organism's movement was reshaping the local field. The Lagrange point, the gravitational equilibrium that kept us stationary, was shifting. The organism's mass, in motion, was pulling the equilibrium with it. If it continued, big CH2 would be dragged out of position and into a decaying trajectory. We would drift toward Jupiter, toward Saturn, toward the organism, toward whatever the probes had found when they went dark. Okafor made the call at 2130. Emergency evacuation. The escape vehicle was a modified crew return module docked on the station's underside, designed for exactly this scenario, although the scenario the designers had in mind was hull breach or fire, not a 3.8 astronomical unit organism destabilizing the gravitational field of the outer solar system. We had 3 minutes to grab personal effects and essential data. I grabbed the data drives with the probe archive. All of it. Every frame, every telemetry log, every piece of evidence that the thing in Grid 7 existed. Singh grabbed nothing. He stood at the comm panel in Module A and transmitted one final message into the deep space channel. I didn't hear what he said. The station's emergency alarm was too loud. Okafor pulled him away from the panel and toward the docking port. We sealed the hatch. The escape vehicle detached. I watched CH2 through the viewport as we accelerated away. The station, my home for 11 months, The place where I'd spent every day talking to 200 machines that did exactly what I told them until they didn't, shrank against the void. And beyond the station, where the stars should have been, a band of absolute darkness stretched across the sky from horizon to horizon. Wider than before, moving. I could see the edge of it creeping across the star field in real time, eclipsing stars as the organism continued to unfold and extend and drift through the space we had just occupied. The escape vehicle's instruments glitched as we passed through the outer fringe of the electromagnetic field. Navigation went erratic. Compass spun. The hull resonated at a frequency that made my teeth ache and my sternum vibrate, and something in the deepest part of my brain fire a signal that was older than language, older than thought. A pure mammalian certainty that I was in the presence of a predator so far above me on the chain that the concept of the chain no longer applied. Then we cleared the field. The instrument stabilized, the stars came back, the resonance faded. The band of darkness was still visible through the aft viewport, but it was behind us now, and shrinking. The transit to Ganymede took 14 days. But nobody spoke for the first 3. Ganymede Colony processed us as an emergency crew return. Medical evaluation, psychological screening, debriefing. The debriefing lasted 9 days. I gave them everything: the probe data, the photographs, the composite mosaic, the mass fluctuation analysis, the gravitational readings, the electromagnetic field measurements, the swarm convergence logs. I gave them Singh's comm logs, the 40-watt anomaly in cargo bay C, the 40-minute correlation. I gave them the gravimetric footprint showing a 3.8 astronomical unit organism unfolding in the space between Jupiter and Saturn. The debrief panel consisted of 4 administrators, 2 scientists, and a military liaison. The administrators took notes, the scientists asked questions. The military liaison asked one question: had I transmitted any of this data to non-authorized channels? I said no. He nodded and didn't speak again. The panel's preliminary finding, delivered 6 weeks later, classified the incident as a probe swarm behavioral malfunction resulting in loss of assets and necessitating emergency crew return. The station's gravitational anomalies were attributed to an uncharted mass in the outer solar system, possibly a rogue planetoid or dark matter concentration, that had since moved out of the observation area. The electromagnetic interference was attributed to a solar storm event. Singh's psychological evaluation flagged him for mandatory counseling. The probe photographs, the 47 frames from 1138, the 200 frames from the perimeter probes, the composite mosaic showing the segmented body of something older than the Sun, were classified as sensor artifacts resulting from the probe behavioral malfunction, corrupted data, not reliable, not publishable, not to be discussed outside of cleared channels. The classification level was high enough that I couldn't tell my mother what had happened, let alone a journal. CH2 was officially decommissioned. The reason given was the same as always: budget reallocation. The station was too expensive to resupply. The deep survey program was being transferred to autonomous platforms. The crew positions were being eliminated. Nothing about the organism, nothing about the swarm, nothing about the 40-minute heartbeat that had been breathing through the station walls for 11 months. Okafor accepted a desk position at Ganymede Colony and stayed. Singh was transferred to a ground facility in Bangalore. I was told, politely, that my skills would be better utilized in an educational capacity. They offered me a teaching position at a community college in Flagstaff, Arizona. Unmanned Systems 101. I took it, not because I wanted to, because the alternative was to stay in the system and watch the data disappear into classification folders and know that nobody was looking at the sky. In Flagstaff, at least, I could look at the sky myself. The probe archive wasn't classified. That was the one mistake they made. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake. The probes were autonomous units running on a public research framework. Their telemetry data was stored in a JPL database that any researcher with the right credentials could access. And the debriefing panel classified the photographs, the analysis, the gravimetric data, and the incident report. But they didn't classify the raw telemetry logs, probably because the logs, on their own, looked like nothing. Columns of numbers, probe IDs, timestamps, coordinates, signal strengths. You'd have to know what you were looking at. I know what I'm looking at. Every Sunday night after my last class of the week, after I've graded whatever papers need grading and eaten whatever passes for dinner, I open my laptop and I pull up the JPL probe telemetry archive and I check my probes. Not all of them are gone. Of the 200 units in the swarm, 34 were lost to the organism, either destroyed by proximity or absorbed into its electromagnetic shadow. The remaining 166 were last tracked during the evacuation, all converging on Grid 7. When CH-2 was decommissioned, the relay station that maintained communication with the swarm went offline. The probes lost their uplink. They couldn't phone home, but they didn't stop transmitting. The mesh network, the probe-to-probe communication system, is still active. The probes are still talking to each other. And because the mesh network operates on a frequency that several deep space listening arrays can detect, the telemetry occasionally gets picked up by ground stations and logged in the archive. Fragments, snippets. A few seconds of data from a probe that drifted close enough to a relay satellite to be heard. The data is sporadic, incomplete, and deeply unsettling. The surviving probes are not in the outer solar system anymore. Their coordinates, when I can extract them from the fragmentary telemetry, show a trajectory that tracks inward, past Jupiter's orbit, past the asteroid belt, into the inner solar system. Over 14 months, the probes drifted along a path that carried them from 7.2 astronomical units to approximately 1.3 astronomical units, just outside Earth's orbit. They were following something, the organism. Their trajectory matches a transit path, a body moving inward from the outer solar system, past Mars, past the asteroid belt, curving around the inner system, and heading back out. A 14-month passage through the region of space where humanity lives, and nobody noticed. No observatory flagged it, no survey detected it, no amateur astronomer photographed it. An organism 3.8 astronomical units long transited the inner solar system, passing within 0.3 astronomical units of Earth, closer than Venus. And the entirety of human civilization was looking the other way. Maybe the organism was dormant during the transit, curled again, compressed, reducing its profile. Maybe it moved through the plane of the ecliptic at an angle that kept it out of the survey fields. Maybe the probe's electromagnetic shadow obscured it. I don't know. What I know is the telemetry. The probes were there. They followed it. The timestamps prove it. The trajectory data proves it. And the probes, the ones that are still transmitting, that still occasionally ping a listening array and deposit a few seconds of data in the JPL archive. Those probes are now heading back out, past Mars, past Jupiter, back toward the outer solar system, following the organism home, or wherever it goes when it's done passing through. I think about the 40-minute pulse sometimes, the heartbeat, the rhythm that the station breathed. I wonder if Earth felt it during the transit. I wonder if the power grids fluctuated, if people had trouble sleeping, if the background hum of the planet shifted by a frequency too low to consciously detect, but present enough to sit in the bones of 8 billion people for 14 months, while something ancient drifted past their sky. I wonder if anyone checked. The data is there, in the probe archive, for anyone who wants to look. The login is public. The telemetry is raw. The numbers tell the story if you know which numbers to read. Nobody has looked. Nobody has asked. The probes drift. The archive updates. The timestamps accumulate. And every Sunday night, in a rented apartment in Flagstaff, Arizona, I sit at my kitchen table and I open my laptop and I check on 200 machines that I built to catalog rocks, and now catalog the passage of something that does not have a name. The last telemetry fragment I received was from Probo 344, picked up by the Goldstone Deep Space Network station on a Tuesday afternoon 6 weeks ago. The probe was at 4.7 astronomical units, heading outbound. Its camera was still active. The image it captured, a single frame, low resolution, transmitted across a distance that ate most of the data, showed stars. A normal, unremarkable star field. But in the lower left corner of the frame, barely visible in the compression artifacts and the transmission noise, There was a region slightly darker than the surrounding space, a patch of sky where the star density dropped. Not by much. You'd have to know what you were looking at. I know what I'm looking at. It's still out there, patient, unhurried, following a path it has followed for longer than this star has burned. And my probes follow it, and I follow my probes. And the Sunday nights stretch out, one after another, the laptop screen glowing in the kitchen, the numbers scrolling, the data accumulating, and the silence of a universe that is not as empty as I once believed it was pressing against the windows of a rented apartment in the high desert, where a man who used to talk to machines sits alone and watches the lights in the archive dim, one by one, as the probes drift further from everything I can reach and closer to something I will never understand.